Bombs sent to homes and offices of private citizens, children and elderly cut down at houses of worship, terrorist acts of violence perpetrated by Americans against Americans. The images are not unfamiliar. We've seen these before. Today on Black Almanac, our guests talk about whether or not we can agree or disagree civilly. I'm Renee James Gilmore. Welcome to Black Almanac. Judge Williams, thank you so much for joining us again today. Ms. Sheslow, thank you for coming to talk about the Tree of Life and what's going on with the Jewish Federation. And Mr. Trevor Harvey, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about, can we talk civilly? Can we disagree without literally taking people out and going off the rails these days? Judge Williams, before this is over, we're going to be looking to you to tell us a little bit about, from a legal perspective, how can we look to the justice system to help us overcome some of these issues that we're having, okay, understanding that you cannot legislate and you can't make people, from a judicial standpoint, do the right thing. But we certainly want to say our condolences, and our heart goes out to the people who have suffered, families included, in Pittsburgh.
Thank you.
And I had the great pleasure of attending the memorial vigil with other people from our area who certainly say we have to have some peace in our lives here.
Yes, thank you for being there. We appreciate it.
So, like the African American community, I know that the Jewish community is a very small group, and even though the event took place in the murders took place in Pittsburgh, we know that you still have people who are very connected to that Pittsburgh event. We talk oftentimes about the phrase about, there's only 6 degrees of separation, and we know that in these very small communities, like the African American community, like the Jewish community, it's more like 3 degrees of separation. Yeah. So what's happening with families here that are close to what has happened in Pittsburgh?
There actually are a handful of former Pittsburghers, I've learned that that's what they're called, Pittsburghers, who live here now. I'm quite close with a few of them, including one of our rabbis, Rabbi Werbo at Temple Beth Shalom, who before coming here, his last pulpit was at a synagogue about 8 blocks away from the Tree of Life, which means that he knew many of the people who were congregants and some who were murdered. I know he flew back to Pittsburgh to attend a funeral. It's crushing, it's heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking when it happened in Charleston to a black church. It's heartbreaking when it happened in Pittsburgh, especially when a marginalized and minority community is targeted. And that's why I think our communities are such good friends, because we understand.
Yeah, we've seen this before. Mr. Harvey, as the president of the local branch of the NAACP, events taking place, let's just say homegrown terrorism taking place in houses of worship, NAACP has been dealing with for many, many decades now, not just years, decades.
Yeah, I would say pretty much for our 110-year existence, we've been dealing with these type of horrific and tragic incidents around the United States of America. What's been happening lately, just even last week with all of these packages being delivered around the country to political officials and television media outlets, brings me back to a period of the 50s and the 60s when you stood out, you spoke out, you advocated for change, you advocated for the underserved, you advocated for the underprivileged, you mobilized communities to go out and exercise their right to vote and register to vote. You didn't know whether you may survive the next day or not, because your house could be bombed, car could be bombed, you could be gunned down in the middle of the street. It brings me back to that period, and one have to ask the question, is that the period that we're going back to?
Judge, what are you seeing? Is that the period we're going back to when people show up in the court seeking some kind of relief from being terrorized at home?
Well, unfortunately, domestic terrorism has been a part of this country probably since the Pilgrims got here. If you ask the indigenous people, were they victims of terrorism, they would tell you that. But I think what we're seeing today is a situation in which certain constitutional rights that we all take for granted in a way may be being abused, and maybe the fundamental bedrock freedom that we have is freedom of speech. Now we're getting into an area of freedom of speech and freedom of expression that is going into unprecedented levels in terms of hatred and vitriol. And we have to test our Constitution occasionally, and our Constitution's being tested a great deal. What limits do we put on speech? What limits do we put on expression? Certainly our political climate has sort of crossed the lines in terms of what can be said publicly. What may have used to been said privately is now being expressed openly. And there's no doubt that this has fanned the flames of hatred and made certain acts which normally people may not have said or done realities. And that's what we have to look at, I think, from a legal point of view. Is it up to us now to make certain limits on how we express ourselves and what we say, knowing that those words have fanned violence, and in this case in Pittsburgh, murder?
And it is interesting that we talk about this freedom of expression. You know, back in the day when this entire country was dealing with things like, let's say, the Ku Klux Klan, people were easily able to put on a hood and hide behind the white cloth and do unspeakable things. And we have some of that happening in social media, where people can be kind of, you know, anonymous and say anything, and it's troubling. You know, real people get hurt. We spoke recently with Commissioner Shaw, who is from this area. His family has been in Florida, been in Sarasota, in fact, for some 113 years, he proudly says. He was here in the days when we saw all kind of unspeakable things also. He reminds us, as having been a former postal worker, that people who are innocent, the ramifications of the kind of acts that we've been seeing can touch people. I want you all to hear a little bit about what he had to say about how innocents can get hurt.
A carrier, a clerk, or postal employee going to work, leaving their family, going to work that morning or that night, whenever, and one of these devices go off unbeknownst because of a piece of machinery or jarring. Those are even more hurt. Those are innocent people. The carrier delivers a piece to put it in the hands of a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. Hi, Tommy. Hey, Mr. Mailman. And it goes off. It's awful. The impact, the inconsequential impact that these events have. They aren't just, you impact far more than your target when you do this.
Thoughts, Judge?
Well, you know, again, the unintended consequences of innocent acts. You know, certainly when, and looking at it from a constitutional and a legal perspective, certainly the stifling of freedom of speech and freedom of expression did not contemplate Twitter. It did not contemplate Facebook. It did not contemplate some of the other social media outlets you have. You mentioned the fact that in the past the Klan would wear hoods to cover their identity. Well, laws were passed to prevent people from wearing hoods in public, just so that people would be able to see who was actually spewing the hate. You don't have that anymore. And so we're now dealing with technology actually attacking our Constitution in terms of, well, how do we prevent this from happening? And then the bigger question is, how do we change the minds of the people who are posting these things? What do we need to do as a nation to make certain that people don't have that thought process, or we certainly be able to isolate those who have that thought process? You're talking about issues involving mental health. You're talking about issues involving education. Many people who actually use the Constitution for protection never read it. They don't even understand what's in it. They speak in terms of broad powers of the Constitution, but you ask them about specific clauses in the Constitution and they don't know it. So we have to educate ourselves as to actually what is protected speech And certainly not all speech is protected. You can't yell fire in a theater, for instance. So we have to legislate what we can, but we also have to educate the public. And it's the part of changing minds and hearts that's very difficult.
It is about changing hearts and minds for sure. I know when we talk oftentimes about how do we get over where we are now, and dehumanizing people is one of the culprits, if you will, that people aren't seen as people. But when we talk as neighbors, it kind of changes the perspective. It is why we say, for example, having children to play together and learn early on that we're neighbors. Humanizing people is so critical. When you talk about education and educating our general public about what goes on in the Jewish community, talk to us a little bit about that, please.
Well, you know, the first thing that I do is ensure that the Jewish community understands that it's okay to be proud of who you are. Just because you're proud of who you are and what your religion is doesn't mean that you're putting down somebody else who may look different from you or pray to a different God than you. And, you know, Judge Williams and I were discussing earlier, I dislike the word tolerance. I don't tolerate you because you have a different skin color than I. I accept you, right? We shouldn't tolerate other people. We should accept other people. And that is another part of that education that is obviously lacking. You know, before internet trolls came around, this guy in Fort Lauderdale, he was anonymously sending packages. He didn't do it over the internet. So, you know, the internet is accelerating this by allowing people to feel as though they're anonymous so that they can say whatever they want. But it's been going on for many years before that. And I agree. We do need to, we need to keep up with the new technology so that we don't keep letting people spew hatred in this manner that then turns into real violence.
You know, there are some sociologists and psychologists who say that in this realm where we are letting our children just kind of sit in front of their iPhones or sit in front of their cell phones, period, and be detached from real people, not going out on the playground to integrate with folks, helps moves forward, if you will, this we're not really talking, and we are talking with avatars, playing with avatars, instead of seeing people as real, live, bleeding individuals. Mr. Harvey?
Well, you know, I know when I grew up, and probably for many that's sitting around this table, we had no other choice but to go outside and engage with each other and with our peers. You know, especially on, you know, Saturday, you wouldn't fit to sit in, after you did your chores, you wouldn't fit to sit in the house and watch cartoons all day. You got a little bit of time to watch cartoons, but you was out engaging, you was developing those social skills, you were embracing, you know, other individuals from other communities and stuff. And we've gone away from that because you're absolutely right. This generation today, it's all about the iPhones, it's all about the tablets, it's all about, you know, the Xboxes and the PlayStations. So they've completely detached themselves from really being engaged with their brothers and their sisters. And I think if we can get back to the way some of us were raised, we may be able to minimize, we may not be able to reduce it all, but we may be able to minimize some of the hatred that we see go on, you know, within our communities and our societies. Because if we're really going to be our brothers and our sisters and our neighbors, we really need to be that. You know, I know like those that live in my community, we don't even call each other by our names. You know, when we walk out the door, it's like, hey neighbor, how you doing? You know what I'm saying? Because they're truly our, you know, our neighbor. You know, we look out for each other. And I think if we all take that model, I think we can begin to move our communities in this world in the right direction.
Chief Judge Williams, when you talk about constitutional rights being tested these days, because we're in a realm where we've never been before, but certainly voting rights as a constitutional right, freedom of religion as a constitutional right, freedom of speech as a constitutional right. There's a lot going on right now that really speaks to the nation that we have been and the nation that we hope to be. So as we talk about some constitutional amendments, constitutional rights, what do you see coming in the next 5-6 years that the judicial system is going to have to really focus on or see a lot of, as this whole thing with social media, freedom of speech, say anything, do anything, seems to be a fear that many of us have about where our country is going?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to understand is that we have these three branches of government. And recently, there has been some dispute about one of the basic amendments that we have, which is the 14th Amendment, which talks about being born in the United States makes you a native of the United States. That's under attack, which is kind of unbelievable because that's one of the basic tenets of our Constitution. And what happens is you begin to legislate. And the reasons that we have courts is a check and balance in power. And we have to be very, very wary of those who all of a sudden look at the Constitution as just another tool of the legislature or as another tool of governance. It's not, it's our bedrock. And I think what we have to be very, very cognizant of, and this is why it's very tricky, is that we do not wish to erode our constitutional rights, but we need to understand that our constitutional rights can be subject, if we are asleep at the wheel, of a body of legislators or an executive power that tends to say, what's getting in the way of us doing what we really want as an agenda? It's this Constitution. It's bothersome. What is this idea of someone being born in the United States having all the privileges of the United States citizens? Let's get rid of that. That's not a constitutional issue. That's an executive and a legislative issue. So we have to be very, very aware of it. So the Constitution is a sword and it's a shield. Its most important function, I think, is as a shield. And so, although many people think that we should put limits on speech and put limits on expression, I'm a little bit wary of it. I think it's more important to change the way we think versus changing the way that we legislate. So, as a constitutional person, I believe in the freedom of speech, I believe in the freedom of expression, but I think technology has challenged us now more so than ever.
Absolutely. Recently, Andrew Gillum, who is the mayor of Tallahassee, also running for the gubernatorial position here in Florida, he attended Bethlehem Bible Church, which is one of the oldest historically African-American churches here in Sarasota. My great-grandmother attended that church for a while, and I would go with her periodically. And sitting in that church with so many other people, I certainly was taken back to a time when I can easily feel how people in the 60s, 70s, 40s, 50s, choose the era, would have been very uncomfortable and very cognizant of their environment because you are sitting in a house of worship and having some political dialogue go on, if you will. I'd like for you all to hear a clip from what Mayor Andrew Gillum had to say about leadership at the top and setting the tone from a political perspective or political dialogue.
And I think all of us, all political leaders, have to figure out a way that we can disagree with each other on the merits of our policy positions. But what we don't do is we don't take steps that, quite frankly, cause people to fear for their safety because our rhetoric becomes so heated, so hot.
What's going to be your next step at the Jewish Federation in terms of educating locally individuals or action items that you see going forward?
Yes, you know, something that we have done and will continue to do is interfaith outreach. It's one of the reasons why Trevor is a good friend of mine and we work with Judge Williams often. We want to be friends with our neighbors, and by being friends with each other, that also means talking about ourselves and each other and learning about what makes you tick, what makes me tick, what's important to me and what's important to you. And at the bottom, at the foundation of that, that really is education. You know, having a dialogue, right? Dialogue means to have two people talking, listening and talking, not just a conversation, right? You can have one person talking and the other person is in one ear, out the other. But if you have a real, true dialogue, that means that you're listening to each other and thinking and then engaging in the dialogue. And that's what's missing, I really think, in a lot of our society.
Talk to us a little bit about who was on the stage at the vigil that was recently held. You had people from across the board.
Yes, we had many Jewish faith leaders spanning the denominations from Reconstructionists to Orthodox. We had pastors, we had reverends, we had an imam, which was really lovely, and the members of the audience who were there, not just on the dais, but the members of the audience were a huge mix of different colors, races, different religions. We all came together because we want to support each other. And if this had happened to another community, we would have been there to support as well. And I think that's what's so great about, we all have a lot to work on in our city, and nobody's perfect, but we're friendly, and we support each other when we need it. And I'm proud of that.
Mr. Harvey, you attended that vigil. What was your observation of the crowd, the people who came out in support and in memorial to the victims?
Well, my sentiments are the same as Jesse's. When I got there, I was just like, wow, this is powerful. This is really what our community should look like. People from different backgrounds, whether it's color, social, economic, religion, gender, can come together and stand together and say, my brother and my sister is struggling. They need us. We're going to stand in the gap. We're going to stand there and help hold them up, because at the end of the day, we're all in this. Just as the communities from across the country came together in 2015 when the church got bombed in Charleston, South Carolina. The people around the country stood up with that community from different backgrounds. And we wanted to make sure that we were there to basically do our part and say, hey, we're here. Because if you really look at it, and Jess and I have these conversations all the time, is our communities are not too different. The Jewish community and the African American community is really not that different. When you look at what they went through in the Holocaust, and you look at what we went through a period of slavery, it's really not that different, because both of those communities were seen as dehumanized. They wasn't, human. We were looked at as peasants and, like dirt, So when you really look at that, our community should stand together and should stand side by side and say, hey, you're my brother, my sister, I'm here with you.
One of the things that the NAACP and many other activist organizations have always focused on has been voting, and why voting is so important. So much so that we don't have the Constitution turned into just simply a tool. But when we still hear people in this day and time saying voting doesn't matter, it does. Talk to us. Let's talk a little bit about why voting is the beginning. It's the foundation of all of these things.
Voting is so critical. I made a post earlier on Facebook, either yesterday or today, as a result of what happened at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. And one of the things that I said is that these horrific and tragic incidents that are occurring on minority communities must stop. And one of the ways that they must stop is we have to have leaders and powers to be in office that want to make change. And if not, then we need to seek somebody else who is going to advocate for the correct, change. Yes, I believe in our constitutional rights and our constitutional amendments, but sometimes at the end of the day, we may have to make some adjustments. Should people be able to go out there and get a stock for a basic gun and then turns it into, a semi-automatic weapon? These are the kind of things that we need leaders to really sit down and having meaningful, dialogue and discussion on, is how can we reduce what we're seeing that's happened around this country?
Something that seemed very profound to me when I read it was 300,000 individuals thought my vote doesn't count. Well, that's 300,000 votes. Your vote counts. Your vote counts, your vote counts, my vote counts. Vote. It's not just something that we can do as Americans. It's our responsibility as Americans. So, get out the vote.
The one thing I always tell people, especially young people, from an African American, it's a sin not to vote. It's a sin not to vote because of all of the African Americans who died just trying to vote. So from a moral perspective, not voting dishonors all of those people who died, white and black, Jews and Gentiles, who fought for us to get the right to vote and to not vote, and for women who were denied to vote until the beginning of the 20th century. It's a sin not to vote, just from a moral perspective. Forget the legal part. It's to me, it's a sin.
The freedoms that we have today have not come at a cheap price, for sure.
They came at the hands of many people's lives, blood, sweat, and tears and death, a lot of the liberties that we have. But, I have a motto is, if you don't vote, don't complain. If you don't vote, you're just on the menu. You're not at the table. And if you want to be at the table and you want to be a part of the process for change, you gotta vote. You have to exercise that right, to vote.
It impacts where you can live. We have been through a time in this country where redlining was the order of the day. The judicial system had to come rescue us from that. Where your children go to school, how much money is spent on their education, whether or not they will be able to read, everything goes back to voting. So hopefully people are not just going to vote, that's absolutely critical, but becoming well informed about the issues. So none of us are determining what to vote for or who to vote for, but we are all got to be concerned about people being thoroughly educated so that your interests are represented. Even if they say, my vote may not count, go vote anyway, as we hear.
You have to look at some of the elections. I know even, and Judge, you can speak to this as well, just here locally over the years, I can remember we had some elections that was decided by like 60 votes, 300 votes. So you can't tell me when you have a turnout that small or numbers that small that it does not matter, that your vote does not matter. Your vote is very critical.
Ms. Cheslow, we want to close with asking you, what can we do as a community to be supportive of the Jewish communities and families that are undergoing such what has to be concern and fear at this point in time?
I created a little list that I put onto Instagram and said, friend, and reach out to a Jewish brother or sister and tell them that you support them. Go to a vigil. At this time, now there are hundreds of vigils going on around the country. And share a story, share something, even if it's in person or on social media, about a friendship that you have with somebody in the Jewish community. Because I know that there are many of those stories. And, again, reach out your hand and say, I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll be back next week. Thank you, Suncoast.
The ABC7 First Alert weather app just got even better. It's easy to use once you download it. First, tell the app to follow you, so you get alerts pinpointed to exactly where you are. Then customize your settings with all the places you go, from the beach to grandmother's house. Get accurate alerts for everyone you care about. You can even pick which weather alerts and categories you want and what they sound like. More ways to customize and more ways to keep your family safe. Download the ABC7 First Alert weather app today.
Support the Hurricane Michael Relief and Disaster Fund by donating to the United Way of Northwest Florida today. Help communities rise and rebuild after the devastating mess left behind. 100% of all Hurricane Michael donations are applied to the local relief efforts in the Northwest Florida area. Every donation makes a difference and is appreciated. Together, we are all Panhandle Strong.
Like ABC7 WWSB on Facebook.